The silence in the living room was unbearable, thick as molasses and suffocating. My father, usually so composed, stood frozen in the doorway, his hand gripping the edge of the frame as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His face was a storm, shock, confusion, and something unnameable swirling together. The words I had just spoken still hung in the air, heavy and raw. "Dad, I'm gay." The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second pounding in my ears like a drumbeat. I braced myself for the worst: anger, rejection, disappointment. Instead, he let out a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling as though he'd been holding it in for years. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't catch it, he said, "So am I." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. My father, the man I had idolized, feared, and at times misunderstood, was gay? My heart raced as I tried to process his words. He walked slowly toward me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "There's something I need to tell you," he whispered. His voice cracked, and in that moment I knew my life, and everything I thought I knew about him, was about to change forever. I grew up in a small, quiet town tucked between rolling hills and endless fields of wheat. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and the color of your curtains. For as long as I could remember, I felt out of place there, like a single out-of-tune note in an otherwise harmonious melody. My name is Daniel, and at 24 years old, I had spent my entire life hiding who I was from the people I loved most, especially my father. Dad wasn't just a father. He was a cornerstone of the community, a retired Marine and high school football coach. He was the kind of man people looked up to, stoic, dependable, and unapologetically traditional. To the outside world, he was a rock, but to me, he was an enigma. We had always had a strained relationship, one marked by unspoken expectations and a silent agreement to avoid anything too emotional or vulnerable. Growing up, my mother's absence loomed like a shadow over our home. She had passed away when I was 5, leaving Dad to raise me on his own. He poured everything he had into his job and his role in the community, but at home, he was distant, as though keeping busy would drown out the grief. I learned to navigate life without asking for too much, without being too much. By the time I reached adulthood, the weight of my secret had grown unbearable. I knew I was gay by the time I was 13, but in our conservative town, that wasn't something you said out loud. I avoided relationships, avoided questions, and avoided anything that might betray who I really was. I built my life around walls, keeping everyone at a safe distance. My best friend, Amy, was the only person who truly knew me. Amy was vibrant and unapologetically herself, with a laugh that could light up a room. She had been my lifeline through the years, always encouraging me to be brave, to live authentically. But bravery seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. The small house my father and I shared sat on the edge of town, surrounded by towering oaks and the hum of cicadas. It was simple and unassuming, much like our lives. Our days were a series of routines: work, dinner, the occasional game on TV, punctuated by long stretches of silence. But all of that changed the moment I sat him down that evening. I was tired of the lies, tired of hiding. I had no idea what his reaction would be, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't live in the shadows anymore. What I didn't know was that my truth would bring his own to light in a way that neither of us could have imagined. It was a Tuesday night, the kind that felt hollow and uneventful, until it wasn't. I had spent the entire day rehearsing the words in my head, the weight of them pressing on my chest like a boulder. After dinner, I set the plates in the sink, my hands trembling slightly as I turned off the faucet. My father sat in his recliner, eyes fixed on the muted television. The faint glow of the screen illuminated his face, making him look older than I had ever noticed before. "Dad," I started, my voice already betraying me with its tremor. He turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "Can we talk for a minute?" The way he shifted in his seat, slightly, cautiously, made my stomach knot. He muted the TV and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What's on your mind? I sat down across from him, my palms damp as they pressed against my thighs. The room felt unbearably small, the walls closing in. My heart raced, but I forced myself to speak. I need to tell you something important. It's about me. His expression didn't change, but I noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers interlocked just a little too firmly. All right, he said evenly, though his tone carried the weight of expectation. I'm gay. The words tumbled out faster than I intended, but once they were in the open, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. My eyes locked onto his face, searching for any sign of a reaction. For a long moment, he said nothing. The air between us thickened, the silence deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady, almost a whisper. You're gay? I nodded, bracing myself for anger, disappointment, anything. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. His face was a storm of emotions, shock, confusion, and something deeper I couldn't quite place. And then, he said something I'll never forget. Daniel, there's something you should know about me, too. My mind raced, trying to process his words. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely audible. He stood up and paced the room, his movements agitated, his breathing uneven. Finally, he stopped and turned to me, his eyes glistening. I'm gay, too. The room seemed to spin, my mind unable to keep up with the words. What? I stammered, unable to believe what I was hearing. I've been hiding it my whole life, he said, his voice breaking. And seeing you finally say it, I don't know. It made me realize I can't keep hiding either. In that moment, the world I thought I knew shattered and reassembled itself in a way I could never have anticipated. My father, the man I had feared would never accept me, had been carrying the same secret. And now, everything was about to change. The days after that conversation were a blur of emotions I couldn't untangle. What should have been a moment of shared understanding between my father and me felt more like an earthquake, leaving rubble and confusion in its wake. Our relationship had always been defined by distance, by walls we both built out of silence and unspoken rules. But now, those walls were crumbling, and in their place, there was an unfamiliar, precarious openness. I remember the first night after I came out to him. My father didn't speak much after his confession. We sat in the living room in silence, both of us unsure of what to say. The TV flickered on in the background, but neither of us watched. The weight of the moment hung between us like a veil, and I could feel the tension pressing on my chest. We weren't comfortable with each other in this new way. We hadn't yet found the language to be father and son, not in the way we were now. The next morning, I left the house early. I needed air. I needed to be alone. I went to the park and sat on a bench, watching the kids play in the distance, their laughter sharp and clear. I envied their simplicity. I envied their innocence, their ability to just be. I wished, more than anything, that I could go back to that time before I knew what it felt like to hide my true self. But there was no going back. I had come out, and the world as I knew it was changing. I spent the next few days wrestling with a storm of emotions, confusion, guilt, fear, and a surprising amount of relief. Part of me was elated by the weight that had been lifted, but another part of me was terrified. The vulnerability I had fought so hard to protect felt raw, exposed. The fear that had driven me to hide my sexuality for so long now morphed into a different kind of fear, the fear of what might happen next. It wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about the world around me, about the town where I had grown up, where people still whispered about anyone who dared to be different. I avoided speaking to Dad for a few days, unsure of what to say. I didn't want to seem like I was pushing him to have all the answers or to suddenly become a different person. But it was hard. The more time passed, the more we seemed to slip further into the silence we had always shared. I missed the man I used to know, the man who was a protector, a provider, someone I could count on to have everything together. But now he was a stranger to me, too. I could sense his own turmoil, the uncertainty of what it meant to be himself after so many years of living in a lie. It was Amy who finally gave me the courage to reach out to him. After a long phone call, full of advice and encouragement, she reminded me that this moment wasn't just about what I had to gain, but what I had to give. "Your dad is probably scared too, you know," she had said. "But he needs you. You need each other right now. Don't let this break you apart." I realized she was right. As much as I was struggling with my own journey, I was part of his now, too. This was our moment of reckoning, and we would have to face it together. That night, after dinner, I walked into the living room, where he was sitting, staring at the same spot on the floor as he had so many times before. This time, I didn't wait for him to say anything first. I walked over to him and sat down. "Dad," I said, my voice softer than I'd ever allowed it to be. "I'm scared. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what comes next." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with the kind of sadness I hadn't seen in years. The kind of sadness that only comes from a deep, unresolved truth. "I'm scared too, son," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I've spent my whole life running from myself, from who I really am. And now," he trailed off, his hands clenched in his lap, "now I'm afraid it's too late to change." I could feel my heart breaking for him, for the man who had always been the embodiment of strength, of unshakable resolve, now sitting before me as vulnerable as I had ever been. The man who had never spoken a word about his own struggles, about the price he paid for keeping a secret for so long. "We don't have to figure everything out all at once," I said, my voice full of an emotion I didn't even know I had: compassion. "We can take this one step at a time, but we need to be honest with each other. For real. No more hiding." And in that moment, something shifted between us. There were no grand proclamations, no sudden healing, but there was understanding. We started small. Slowly, we began to talk more about the things that had always been difficult to say, about our fears and our hopes for the future. Every conversation felt like a breakthrough, each one peeling back layers of unspoken pain. But the journey wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth. There were times when I felt like I was back at square one, battling my own insecurities. The town we lived in wasn't exactly a haven for open-mindedness. I remember the first time I ran into one of my old classmates at the grocery store. Her eyes flickered with surprise when she saw me, and then quickly turned into something colder. She didn't say a word, but I could feel the judgment hanging in the air. It stung. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I wasn't the person she thought I was, but instead, I just walked away. Dad faced his own demons. It was hard for him to talk about what he had been through, about how, for most of his life, he had hidden his truth in fear of rejection. There were long, tense silences between us as he wrestled with his own shame. But there were also moments of tenderness, where he would reach out and touch my arm, his way of saying, "I'm here." And through all of it, I learned that growth isn't linear, that healing takes time, that even in the most difficult moments, you can find the strength to keep moving forward. But it wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the possibility of finding a place in the world where we didn't have to hide, where we could live as ourselves, openly, proudly, without fear of what others might think. It wasn't an easy road, but it was ours. And for the first time in my life, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could find peace with who we were meant to be. It was a crisp Saturday morning when everything came to a head. The town's annual fall festival had drawn nearly everyone out of their homes, including my father and me. We hadn't planned to attend, but after weeks of hesitant conversations and slow progress in rebuilding our relationship, we both decided it was time to stop hiding, not just from each other, but from the world around us. As we wandered through the festival, the smell of cinnamon and roasting chestnuts wafted through the air. Children darted between booths, their laughter ringing out over the hum of conversation. I could feel the eyes on us, though, curious glances that lingered just a little too long, whispers that trailed behind us as we walked. In a town like ours, news traveled fast, and while I hadn't explicitly told anyone outside of Amy, it was clear the rumors had begun to spread. It happened near the pie contest booth. We were standing in line when I heard it, a sharp, cutting voice behind me. "Isn't that Daniel?" "Heard he's, you know." The tone was mocking, dripping with disdain. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." I froze. My chest tightened as heat rose to my face. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Todd Marshall, a former classmate of mine who had bullied me relentlessly in high school. He was the kind of person who thrived on making others feel small, and I had spent years avoiding him. Dad turned first, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard. "Is there a problem, Todd?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Todd smirked, crossing his arms. "No problem at all, Coach. Just didn't expect to see you two here. That's all. Thought people like you prefer to keep out of sight." The crowd around us grew quieter, the tension thickening. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I considered walking away. It would have been easier, safer, to avoid the confrontation altogether. But as I looked at my father, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't backing down. For the first time in my life, I saw him standing not just for himself, but for me too. He took a step forward, his voice steady. "Todd, I've spent too much of my life hiding who I am, pretending to be someone I'm not, because I was afraid of people like you. But not anymore. My son and I, we're done being ashamed of who we are. And if you've got a problem with that, it's yours to deal with, not ours." His words hit me like a tidal wave. This was the man I had grown up with. The man who had always seemed so invincible, so steadfast. But now, he wasn't hiding behind his strength. He was using it to stand beside me. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "Dad's right," I said, my voice louder than I expected. "We're not going to apologize for who we are. Not anymore." The crowd around us seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, I thought Todd might lash out again, but something in my father's unwavering gaze stopped him. He huffed, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, his bravado deflating as quickly as it had risen. The silence broke with a few murmurs, and then, to my surprise, a woman nearby clapped. Others followed, their applause hesitant at first, then growing stronger. I turned to see Amy in the crowd, her face beaming with pride. My father put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. For the first time in my life, I felt free from fear, from shame, from the weight of hiding. I wasn't alone anymore. As we walked away, side by side, I realized that this moment wasn't just about standing up to Todd or the whispers of the town. It was about reclaiming our lives, together. We had faced our greatest fear, the fear of being seen. And in doing so, we had found something stronger than fear, something worth fighting for. The days following the fall festival were quieter than I expected. No dramatic confrontations, no angry mobs, no slurs painted on our front door. There were still whispers, of course, and the occasional judgmental glance. But for the most part, life went on as it always had. The town didn't implode, and the sky didn't fall. In some strange way, that normalcy felt like the biggest relief of all. Dad and I settled into a new rhythm. The silence that used to hang between us like a heavy curtain was gone, replaced by conversations that were slowly becoming easier. We still stumbled sometimes. Old habits die hard, but the effort was there. And the more we talked, the more I saw my father not as the untouchable figure I'd grown up with, but as a man, a flawed, complicated, deeply human man who had spent decades fighting a battle he couldn't win alone. One evening, about a week after the festival, I came home to find Dad in the kitchen, flipping through an old photo album. The sight caught me off guard. He had always been so private about the past. But when he saw me standing there, he didn't close the book or hide it away. Instead, he gestured for me to sit down. "These are from when I was your age," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. The photos were black and white, edges worn with time. In one, he stood with a group of friends, a shy smile on his face. "That's Michael," he said, pointing to a boy with an easy grin. He was my first love." I blinked, unsure of what to say. Dad had never talked about his past relationships before, let alone something so personal. What happened to him? I asked quietly. He sighed, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "We were young, scared. It wasn't safe back then, not like it is now. We drifted apart. I buried that part of myself for a long time after that. Hearing him speak so openly was both heartbreaking and healing. It made me realize just how much he had sacrificed to protect himself, how much he had lost in the process. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes soft. "Don't be. If anything, I'm grateful. Grateful that you don't have to live the way I did, that you have the courage to be who you are." For the first time, I saw his pain not as a burden, but as a testament to his strength. He had endured so much, and yet here he was, standing beside me, ready to face the world with a renewed sense of hope. As the weeks went by, something remarkable began to happen. The walls that had once confined us started to crumble. Not just between Dad and me, but between us and the community. Amy organized a small gathering at her cafe, inviting people from all walks of life to come together and share their stories. It wasn't explicitly labeled as an LGBTQ+ event, but it didn't need to be. It was a space for honesty, for connection, for understanding. At first, I was nervous. What if no one showed up? What if the event only drew more criticism? But when the day arrived, the cafe was packed. There were people I knew, friends, neighbors, even a few familiar faces from high school, and others I didn't. Some shared their own experiences with identity and acceptance. Others simply listened, their presence a quiet show of support. Dad spoke, too. I watched as he stood in front of the crowd, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. He talked about the years he had spent hiding, the fear that had kept him silent, and the relief he felt now, finally stepping into the light. "I'm proud of my son," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'm learning to be proud of myself, too." His words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my own. But now I realized I wasn't alone. We weren't alone. The ripple effects of that night were profound. People who had once kept their distance began to reach out, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. A local teacher approached Dad about starting an LGBTQ+ support group at the high school, something we never would have imagined just a few months earlier. And then there was Todd. One afternoon, as I was walking home from work, he stopped me on the street. I braced myself for another confrontation, but to my surprise, he looked uncertain. "Hey," he said, shuffling his feet. "I just wanted to say, I was out of line at the festival. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to respond." Todd Marshall, the man who had tormented me for years, was apologizing. It didn't erase the hurt he had caused, but it was a start. "Thanks," I said, my voice steady. "I appreciate that." As he walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The wounds of the past might never fully heal, but they no longer define me. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear. But there was also hope. Hope that we could create a future where no one had to hide, where love and acceptance were the norm, not the exception. Dad and I weren't just surviving anymore. We were living fully and authentically for the first time. And in that, we found a kind of freedom that was worth everything it had taken to get there. The moral of our journey was clear. The truth, no matter how painful or frightening, is always worth embracing. Because only when we let go of fear can we truly find ourselves and each other. A year after the fall festival, life looks different, brighter, freer, and more hopeful. My father and I have become closer than I ever thought possible. Every Saturday morning, we meet for coffee at Amy's Cafe, which has become a hub of connection and support for people in the community. The LGBTQ plus support group at the high school is thriving, and Dad volunteers there once a week, sharing his story with students who are navigating their own journeys. The town itself has grown, too. What once felt like a place steeped in judgment has softened, becoming a community where kindness and understanding take precedence. There are still challenges, of course, but there's also progress. At this year's Fall Festival, the local park was adorned with rainbow flags, a quiet but powerful symbol of how far we've come. As for me, I've learned to embrace my identity with pride, not fear. I've started dating someone. His name is Ryan, and he's everything I didn't know I was looking for. Introducing him to my dad felt like a leap of faith, but Dad welcomed him with open arms. Looking back, I realized that the journey my father and I went through wasn't just about acceptance. It was about transformation. We both had to break free from the cages of fear and shame we'd built around ourselves. And in doing so, we discovered a deeper truth. Love, in all its forms, has the power to heal. As I stand with my father at the edge of the park, watching the sun set over the golden leaves, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For him, for myself, for the courage it took to face the world together. The future may be uncertain, but one thing is clear. We are no longer hiding. We are living, loving, and thriving, just as we were always meant to.